Hello, my name is James Walker, and I'm co-founder of the Atheist Christian Book Club. And my guest today is Sean McDowell. We're actually reviewing, studying, discussing his book in our upcoming meeting, and he was gracious enough to be willing to come on for a video conference call and answer some questions. Now, we're already reading the book and are well into it. Some of us have finished it already, and there's been some questions, Sean, that's come up. But before I get to that first question, can you tell me a little bit about what motivated you and your co-author, Jonathan Morrow, to write this book?
Sure. First off, thanks for having me on. When you told me about this Christian Atheist Book Club, I thought, this is awesome. Good for you and everybody in there willing to put their beliefs to the test and have cordial disagreement. I wish a lot more people were doing this. So thanks for doing that and for using my book. There's a lot of good books out there, so I'm honored you'd use my book. Essentially, you go back to the early to mid 2000s, there was a barrage of new books by the new atheists. Obviously, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and they were getting a lot of press. I'd meet students who had read them, either atheists encouraged their belief system or Christians that rocked their faith. And there were some Christians who were responding just to the science, some just to the history, some were a little bit academic, some were really philosophical. And a friend of mine, Jonathan Morrow, and I just thought there's not one single text that's written, hopefully in a charitable, gracious tone, but takes the biggest questions that are being advanced, that I am being asked, kind of a one-stop volume response to some of these common charges that the new atheists are making. So that's essentially why we wrote it.
In preparation for this interview, I had several of our club members say, "Yeah, I'd love to ask Sean a question." And so I've got a couple here now. I have to give our co-founder Bill Cluck. He's the atheist half of our equation.
Okay.
I'm the evangelical Christian of the book club, and our co-founder's Bill Cluck, and he had his first question here. He says, "Hey Sean, the silence of Paul is problematic. Why does Paul make virtually no reference to Christ's parables, his birth narrative, his miracles, or his teachings?"
Yeah, this is a good question. I would say a couple things. First off, when we ask why does Paul say something or not say something, we have to ask the question we would ask of any book, such as you pick up my book, why does Sean not say a ton about the historical Jesus? In his book, Is God Just a Human Invention? Well, one reason is I don't mention the parables of Jesus, the particulars, because that's not the purpose for which we were writing that book. Now, I do in More Than a Carpenter, and I do in some of my other books, but we had a particular focus for writing this book, so we don't talk about them. But the mere fact that we don't talk about some of those particulars doesn't mean that I'm not aware of them. Well, I think the same is true with Paul. Paul, clearly, we can know from some of his own teachings, the references he makes to Jesus, and the mere fact that he calls people frequently in his letters to follow him as he follows Christ, implies that he knows certain things about Jesus, including his parables and including his teachings. So, in the ancient world at that time, if you called somebody to mimic or mirror or follow someone's life, it was assumed that you knew a sufficient or good amount of that person's life. Now, so I think the main reason why Paul doesn't mention it is because it didn't advance the argument he was making in the particular letters. When he writes to Rome or he writes to First Corinthians, well, in First Corinthians, he's writing because they'd become deeply immoral and he's telling them to stop sinning and remember certain truths like the resurrection in First Corinthians 15. So what's interesting though, it's one of my favorite books is a book by Paul Rossetti and Gregory Boyd called The Jesus Legend. And they have a chapter on the Apostle Paul. And they actually mention some of the allusions that Paul makes to Jesus. And I think, although he doesn't explicitly list the parables of Jesus, if you read Paul carefully, it's clear that he knows a lot about the historical Jesus and references it when it advances the point that he's making within the text. So just bear with me for a second. But for example, uh, we know that Paul knew Jesus was born and raised as a Jew, Galatians 4:4, that he was a descendant of Abraham, Galatians 3, Romans 1. He had a brother named James, Galatians 1, other brothers as well, 1 Corinthians 9. He had a number of disciples who ministered with Jesus, 1 Corinthians 9:5. He knew that Jesus was betrayed, 1 Corinthians 11, that he was executed by criminals, 1 Corinthians 1 and Galatians 5, that he was aware that Jesus instituted a memorial meal the night before his death, 1 Corinthians 11. Frequently, Paul references the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, which he says is that which is most important in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He goes on and on in this text. He says, Paul knew Jesus' earthly life was characterized by meekness, gentleness, self-sacrificial love, and humble service. You see that in Philippians 2, 5 through 7. And he consistently held up Jesus' life as a model to be emulated in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. So bottom line is he didn't mention these particulars because he didn't need to. It didn't advance his point. The mere fact he doesn't mention them doesn't mean he doesn't know about them. And then when we look closely throughout the rest of Paul's text, it's amazing how much he does reference, when he advances his arguments, different truths about the life of Jesus.
I think it's significant that while Paul doesn't mention the somewhat minor miracles, walking on water, turning water into wine, he does cover the big miracles, the creation of heaven and earth, the resurrection. These are the miracles that he does talk about clearly. So anyway, that's a good observation. And what was the name of the book again you were recommending?
It's called The Jesus Legend. It's my favorite historical Jesus book. It'd be a great one to consider reading or studying. And it's by Gregory Boyd, The Jesus Legend, with Baker Publishing.
Well, great, great. Well, Bill has the second one for us here, and he says that the outsider test of faith is called the silver bullet against Christianity. So here's our silver bullet. And why is it in most cases a person's faith is determined by two things: where they live and what religion their family happens to be. And he added when he mentioned it to me, you're a case in point. You know, your dad, Josh McDowell, no accident that you happen to be a Christian and an apologist.
Yeah, it's certainly not an accident that I have to be a Christian and apologist, because I specifically told my father when I was about 19 that I wasn't sure that what he believed was true. And my dad looked at me and he goes, "Son, I think that's great." I said, like, "Did you hear anything that I just said? Why would that be great? You're this great defender of the faith." He goes, "Look, I haven't raised you to just believe things because I said it. I've raised you to seek truth and to read both sides." He said, "You can't believe something just because I do. You've got to decide for yourself what you think is true. And you know your mom and I love you no matter what." So it's true. I do believe a lot of the same things. There's areas where my dad and I disagree, but in the big picture, things were in a similar vein. But my parents have not raised me to believe things simply on authority or simply what they tell me. My dad's often played devil's advocate with me, even on things he believes, just to get me to think. Now, you said it's Bill who said this. He's
Yeah.
absolutely right. I mean, unmistakably, most people believe what their parents believe. That's true for Muslims. That's true for Jews. That's true for atheists. That's true for Hindus. It's human nature to tend to believe that which we're told. And this is where I think Jesus is right, where he said we're just kind of like sheep. Sheep just kind of follow the sheep in front of them without thinking critically. Even if they run them off a cliff, as I understand it, they'll just follow the sheep in front of them. Now, essentially, this is a sociological question that he's asking. Why do people believe the things, tend to believe what their parents believe? I'm not a sociologist, but I do know that there's a cost for believing things differently from what your parents believed. I weighed that and I told my dad I might not believe the things that you believe. I've seen the cost of Muslims, some friends of mine who are Muslims who became Christians and were essentially disowned by their family. I've seen uh, all sorts of it. I've seen Mormons leave their faith and become agnostics. And you know this because you've done ministry there. The price of leaving the Mormon faith is significant socially and personally. I have a friend of mine who grew up with two moms. And when he became a Christian, they disowned him because they thought he was betraying the beliefs that they had raised him with. So the reality is it takes a lot of courage, and there's a big cost to change one's beliefs, whatever direction that may be. And that's a cost I think most people simply are not willing to really evaluate and consider and pay that cost. I mean, this group that you're having right here with Christians and atheists together is clearly the exception. I mean, most people aren't coming together Skyping in or FaceTiming in, listening to people and weighing ideas and really considering what if I change my beliefs and why. It's the exception. I think the answer is, whether it's satisfying or not, is most people, not all people. I appreciate how Bill asked this, not all people. There are people who don't believe the things simply told them. But it's true that we tend to believe as a whole, as human beings, that which our parents or authorities believe because it takes time, it takes energy, there's a personal cost to change.
But
That's the way reality is.
but that doesn't also it doesn't affect the truthfulness or the falsity of the proposition. So if everybody in the world followed one direction or another, that still doesn't deal with the question: is Christianity true or false? And when Bill asked the question, my first thought was he and I both are basically disprove the rule. He was raised
Mhm.
Christian and he converted to atheism, and I was raised Mormon, converted to Christianity. So it was
Interesting.
the exceptions. There's enough exception out there that I think would question that rule that you're always just going to believe whatever your culture, what part of the world you're born in, that kind of thing.
Look, I have an admiration for anybody who really believes they're following truth, counts the cost, and leaves that which is comfortable and that which is what they're told. I respect that. That's the road less traveled. Now, I'm a Christian, so I hope they come this direction, but I respect people willing to do that.
Well, I've got a question here from Ron Woodruff. I think you met Ron at probably at Cottonwood. You might
Okay,
remember him.
yeah.
He's one of our Christians, members of the club, and he asked a theodicy question. How do you respond to the person who grew up in Sunday school, prayed in all earnestness for healing of herself or a loved one, only to get absolutely nothing from God? In this case, the afflicted one continued to suffer, and the loved one actually died very young. So, how do you address that problem of evil?
Well, the first thing I would do is if somebody lost a loved one who's young, and in our family, some of our family's best friends lost a 15-year-old to cancer, and it was devastating on so many levels. Honestly, this might not be what Ron is looking for, but the first thing I would do is I would cry with the person, I would mourn with the person, I would listen to this person, and I would simply try to be there for him. This 15-year-old kid who died of cancer, he said the greatest present you can give someone is your presence. And I'll never forget it. You know, you read the book of Job, which is dealing with this question essentially. Job's friends did everything right. They did everything right until they opened their mouths and they tried to speak. The
Yeah.
first week they sat there and were just present with him. That was the right thing to do. I mean, you read Romans 12:15 and it says, "Be happy with those who are happy. Be sad with those who are sad." Sometimes just giving a Christian verse, hey, Romans 8:28, all things will work together for the good, is counterproductive
Mm-hmm.
and not helpful. So I would spend a ton of time with the person, just listening, praying, maybe reading the Psalms, just playing checkers, just being with a person, letting them know that I'm doing my best to just love them and be present with them through this tragedy. Now, when the person is at the stage where they want to process and know, why would God have this happen intellectually? I would, my first thing would be to step back and do what Nabil Qureshi has done when I'm sure most, if not all in your group know Nabil, former Muslim, became a Christian, who has stomach cancer, 5% chance of living over the
Very
next
young man.
5 years, mid 30s.
Yes.
One of his early videos, he said, this is a shock, didn't expect it, there's a lot of pain. He said, but what I've done is I've gone back and remind myself of what I know. So if it's just suffering and just my belief in God, well, then suffering it might win. But if I step back and he goes, okay, origin of the universe, the beginning of the universe points towards a beginner. The fine tuning of the universe points towards a fine tuner. Objective morality, the moral law, points towards a moral lawgiver. The emergence of consciousness points towards a higher consciousness. The camera explosion points towards an information input that's there. Um, he goes, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus points towards Jesus conquering death, fulfilled prophecy, reliability of the Bible. He walks through all these things to orient his focus and say, even though I don't know why this is happening, even though it's painful and it doesn't make sense, I have all these other reasons telling me this is true, which can give me the strength to cope with this and this pain that the person is going through a seemingly just, absurd, crazy thing. So that's probably the first step that I would take, and then I'd probably walk through C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain with them step by step
C.S.
as
Lewis.
gracefully as I could. Yeah, Lewis's The Problem of Pain, I think, deals with this question as well as anybody does. But just make sure that we separate the emotional, pastoral question from the philosophical intellectual question.
I understand. People, they sometimes will ask the question, but they're really, at that point, now they may want the answer to that question later, but you have to be sensitive that they're really hurting and they're in pain and they really need a friend more than they need someone to try to give a philosophical answer.
I
Yeah,
think
that's
that's
good.
right.
Yeah. Now, these next two questions are from Jim Hall. Jim is the co-host of the Atheist Edge
Okay,
podcast and also
cool.
author of a couple of books on atheism. So he's one of our atheist members. And he says, Sean, regarding chapter 4, does intelligent design fit the definition of a scientific theory? If not, is the um, design proponentist, it's a kind of a search and replace error that showed up in a trial.
Okay.
Does that error evidence of this dishonesty attempting to sneak creationism into the public classrooms when it's already been determined that it was illegal to do that?
Okay, so let me say a couple things first. I I don't know enough about the motivations of the people who pushed the, what is it, the Kitzmiller versus Dover case in 2006
Yes.
to comment on whether they're trying to be dishonest or not. I don't know. But I do know this, the leading intelligent design organization, the Discovery Institute, is actually came out strongly against what was being pushed in that Dover case. Because essentially they weren't really trying to teach creationism. There was just a paragraph that would be read at the beginning when people teach biology and say, oh, if you want to, check out this book of pandas and people. So the Discovery Institute said this is a bad idea. We are against it. And the main reason why is because the Discovery Institute said intelligent design as a science is actually a very young endeavor, historically speaking. And they've been very public saying we're not in favor of intelligent design being taught in schools. We just want a balanced perspective of Darwinian evolution. Show the evidence for and show some of the evidence against and let students decide. So ultimately, I'm sure there's some dishonest people within the broader intelligent design movement. Now, I can say I know the key players in this, and they're not. I know them well. They're people of character. Are there some dishonest people on all sides of this debate? Sure. Now, the question is intelligent design science. In some ways, I'm less hung up on this as I probably was in the past. I'm less concerned whether it's science. I want to know whether it's true. Whether it's philosophical or whether it's science, I want to know if there's really information in the DNA that points towards an information giver. I want to know if the fine-tuning of the universe points towards a mind, etc. So whether we qualify it as a science or not is, the more I've studied this, the less I'm bothered about it. Now, I do think, having studied this, I got a master's in philosophy and took a class on the philosophy of science and read extensively on this. The question of what qualifies as science is not a scientific question. It is a philosophical question. And coming up with a definition of what science is actually notoriously difficult.
Yeah.
Rather, what people do is give necessary and sufficient conditions for something to qualify as a science. And when we do it that way, I think intelligent design can, in principle, qualify as a science. So, for example, is it testable? Well, of course it's testable. I find it ironic that Kenneth Miller says intelligent design is not testable. Furthermore, we've tested it and proven that it's false because he looks at irreducible complexity and says it's false. Well, if it's not testable, you can't say you've tested it and proven it's false. By the very fact that people test it shows that it is testable. So in principle, by that criterion, would qualify as a science. Another one is this something falsifiable? And of course, intelligent design is falsifiable. Third, does a science make predictions? And as we've seen, William Dembski in the late 90s predicted that there would be functions found for DNA, and he's been found to be right.
The
So
so-called junk DNA.
junk DNA,
Yeah.
exactly. So I do think a good case can be made that intelligent design qualifies as science. And I think actually some objections intentionally and uncharitably, maybe in the way somebody earlier took out verse references to creationism and just put intelligent design. If somebody did that the way I think you said it was Jim was mentioning, that would be dishonest. Similarly, on the other side, some people intentionally just call intelligent design creationism to discredit in a way rather than understand what it actually is. I think both of those would be mistaken ways. There's a clear difference between creationism, whether old Earth or young Earth, and intelligent design philosophically and their approach to looking at the evidence. But when it's
Mm.
all said and done, I just want to know if it's true.
Yeah, same here, and I'm thinking, the fact that there has been cases of fraud in messing with fossils, and it doesn't, that in and of itself, the fact that there was dishonesty by evolutionists does not mean that evolution is false. That doesn't
That's
disprove the
right.
premise. It just means that there were some mistakes that were made, and in some cases on purpose. So I have another one from Jim, a biblical question. Jim asks, if the first canonical gospel was Mark, with all the other accounts were obviously inspired by Mark, and if we know that Mark 16 verses 9 through 20 is a late interpolation, with the original version of Mark ending with the women running away and telling no one that the tomb was empty, then how can I, as an atheist, Jim asks, how can I, as an atheist, be expected not to have any doubts regarding the inerrancy and truth claims of the resurrection story?
I would I would make a distinction between a couple things. There's an important distinction between inerrancy and between the truth of the resurrection. We absolutely unmistakably do not need inerrancy to establish the truth of the resurrection. And I would invite, maybe Jim has read this, or anybody who hasn't, any Christians who haven't read it, Michael Lacona's recent book, well, not recent, it was 2010, his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, with IVP. And he walks through with a minimal facts approach, which was begun by Gary Habermas,
Habermas.
where you use certain historical criteria, multiple attestation, you use criteria like embarrassment, you look through the historical lens of Behan McCullough, and where you evaluate different hypotheses to explain these basic facts and which is the least ad hoc, most plausible, greatest scope, etc., and comes to the very reasonable historical conclusion that the resurrection is the best explanation of the facts without even assuming inerrancy. And I think historically he's absolutely right about that. You see, inerrancy is more of an in-house Christian theological question about how we approach the scriptures and how we make sense of it. And of course, there's differences about whether or not the Bible is inerrant and what exactly inerrancy means. But this is an in-house discussion for somebody who says, okay, Jesus rose from the grave. The Bible reports his words. Now, how do we understand his words? So
Mhm.
I would say to an atheist or skeptic, I would say keep the main thing the main thing. Just simply through historical approach, ask, do we have reason to believe Jesus lived? Do we have reason to believe he died? Do we have reason to believe he was buried? Do we
Mhm.
have reason to believe the tomb was empty and he appeared to people on the third day? What explanation best accounts for that? And I think when compared with hallucinations, the copycat theory, stolen body theory, I think the resurrection stands in a category of its own as being reliable without relying upon inerrancy whatsoever. Now, when it comes to the reliability of the Gospels, I would also say let's approach this first through a historical lens. Let's look at the number of manuscripts. Let's look how early these manuscripts are. Let's see if there's signs of embarrassment internally. Let's see if there's archaeological support. And I think the Gospels as a whole can be shown to be remarkably reliable, especially in comparison with other ancient works of that time. Then we can come to questions like, okay, Mark 16, was this in the original or was it added later? I happen to think it probably was added later, but there's some debate about that passage. There's some debate about John 7:53 through 8:11. That doesn't take away from the confidence of what we know about Mark or John or the other gospels as a whole. It's just an honest admission that there's a few isolated passages we're not certain about.
Yes, yeah, I'm thinking too. He says, can he not be expected to have any doubts regarding inerrancy? I don't think we're asking our atheist friends to have zero doubts. Doubt
Hmm.
can be a virtue. It's in some regards good to be a skeptic on things and to ask the hard questions. And there are Christians that have questions about elements of the like you said, the long ending of Mark, etc. So that doesn't take away though from the those minimal facts that are not in dispute among at least amongst the Christians. So
James, if the standard is not having any doubts, then I'm not a Christian because
yeah,
I
there you
have a
go.
lot of questions. I have
Yes.
doubts. Believe it or not, I'm a skeptic about things. I
Yeah,
really am.
the only Christians that have no doubts are the ones who aren't thinking, which I don't
Mhm.
recommend.
Or they have the gift of faith, which is
Maybe
not
that's it.
you and probably not me either.
Yes.
All right,
Well,
let's
the
keep
final
going.
question I had is from Chris. He's an atheist, also a former Christian. Um, it's a long question, but I think a really good question. So we maybe unpack it a little bit. He asks this. He says in chapter 2 discusses the idea that the human brain is unreliable in trying to understand the world around us. This is presented as a problem with the naturalistic worldview and atheism by extension. But isn't this a problem for theists also? Aren't
Hmm.
theists using their brain to read and comprehend the Bible, to hear and understand sermons, to intuit design in nature and perceive miracles? Indeed, chapter 3 claims that the atheistic worldview, would cause someone to deny a miracle they witnessed themselves. But if the brain is unreliable, why wouldn't they be skeptical? Scientists at least have a peer review process which helps them filter out individuals' flawed perceptions, but the religious have nothing similar, uh, resulting in millennia of schisms and sectarianism. There's a lot to that question, obviously. How would you try to unpack it?
Yeah, good question. I'm not going to unpack all of this, but let me just clarify what the argument is. The argument is not that in principle we can't trust the brain, because it's through the brain that we've got communications, health revolutions, transportation. Obviously, the brain is a remarkable instrument. The argument is if naturalism is true in a way that does not apply to Christianity or theism, then we cannot trust anything the brain tells us is true. Now, why would this be the case? Charles Darwin famously said, the horrid doubt always arises whether the conviction of man's mind, which is developed from the lower animals, is at all trustworthy. Are there any convictions in a monkey's mind? I'm botching the quote, but the idea being, if there are, how can we even trust it? Now, what's his point? He's saying if his theory of blind, unguided, material evolution is true, then it undermines any confidence he can have that his theory is true. Why? Because the guiding principle of Darwinian evolution is natural selection operating on random mutation. In a sense, survival of the fittest is the term that people will use. So the brain has been built, quote, built, not to understand truth, not to understand the world, but simply to survive. And the reality is, we can survive on false beliefs. This is an argument Alvin Plantinga gives and C.S. Lewis did as well. He said, for example, he gives a silly example. He says, if you think when you see a tiger, you're supposed to hug and get close to a tiger, but the most effective way to do that is to go run and go hide in a cave. Well, you have a false belief, but that false belief is going to lead to you surviving. Truth is not necessary for survival. You just need your body to be in the right place at the right time. So essentially, what Plantinga and Lewis are arguing, and we argue in this case, is if naturalism is true, we can't have any confidence in principle that the very things the brain tells us is true, because it's been built for survival, which is not truth. And Darwin himself was aware of this. The same problem does not exist for Christianity. Why? Because even if there's some kind of evolutionary process, it's a God guided, intelligent process that brought human beings about. God is a cosmic mind. He's the word, we're told in John 1 1, which means reason, the logos, rationality. And human beings being made in God's image means that we are made with reason, we are made with rationality, we are made to love God with our minds. So, in principle, Christians or theists of other stripes can rely upon the reliability of the brain because the brain was built to function a certain way. So, you might push back and say, well, wait a minute, we can actually use things like science and show that the brain is reliable. But I think Lewis was right. He said, if reason itself is in doubt, you cannot use reason to establish it.
Mm.
So even relying upon science assumes that science is reliable, assumes that the mind puts us in touch with reality, that there's cause and effect. It assumes all the very things that have to be proven, which, as Darwin pointed out, the naturalistic evolutionary worldview undermines. But theism not only doesn't undermine, gives us a basis for trusting in principle that the brain and or the mind puts us in touch with reality. So it's a philosophical question that's meant and designed as an argument to undermine any confidence in principle the naturalist can have in reason, and to show that a theist can have confidence in reason.
So the idea in chapter 2 is not so much that we're arguing for that reason is not trustworthy. Really, that's assuming some atheist presupposition. It's ironic. I think Sam Harris wrote the book on free will, which he argues that we do not have free will. It's just, our brains are just chemical biological reaction, and that what we have is the illusion of free will. So that's not our argument. That's what the atheists are saying. And so if that's true, then yeah, the results are we could not trust what we are reasoning. But because we're made in the imago Dei, image of God, God made us to be reasonable. So to just wrap up,
Yeah.
I get this a lot from my atheist friends, and maybe a kind of a misunderstanding of what it means to have faith from an evangelical perspective. We're not meaning that faith means there is no evidence. And the moment you have a shred of evidence, then you're no longer in the realm of faith. You're in the realm of fact or probabilities at that point. What does it mean, Sean, to have? What do we mean by faith? Does it mean that
Okay.
it's unreasonable, irrational, or is it faith with a reason?
So let me jump back, if I may, for a minute. I'm not saying that atheists are unreasonable. I have some atheist friends who are much more reasonable than some of my Christian friends. And based on these questions, it sounds like you have some pretty thoughtful atheists within the group. I'm not saying that all Christians have blind faith either. I'm asking and probing which worldview grounds that we can even trust reason in principle. So to even have this whole book club, to read books, to debate, to talk about ideas, both sides, atheist, Christians, and anybody else who's there, is assuming that logic, reason, and rationality are valuable instruments that can put us in touch with reality, whatever reality may be. All of you value or claim to value reason. I'm just saying, if atheism is true, this is a presuppositional argument. If atheism is true, we don't have good reason to trust our reasoning faculties. In fact, if atheism is true, we have good reason to distrust them. That's the basic argument. Now, faith biblically is not blind. It's trusting what we have reason to believe is true. That's one reason Jesus did miracles. That's why Exodus 14:31, when Moses splits the Red Sea, it says, when the people saw the miracle, then they believed.
Yeah,
The
chapter 1 of
miracle,
your book deals with this really thoroughly.
exactly. So you guys, you can read it and see it there. But faith it's a personal trust in God in light of what we have reason to believe is true. And I think God has revealed himself in nature, revealed himself in conscience, in scripture, in miracles, and a variety of ways for people open to the evidence.
And I really appreciate this, Sean. And you've answered some questions, but also I'm sure given us some more things to think about and discuss. And thanks for greeting our club and to be encouraging us. We appreciate that. And thanks again. I'll get back with you after the club sometime and let you know how it went down.
Hey, I'll look forward to it. I wish I could be like a fly on the wall and listen to people responding to these discussions and talking about how I'm right, how I'm wrong. That would be fun. But I will let you guys run with that. Keep up the good work. Thanks for having me and using my book.
Thank you so much.